Fabulous with Vips and Vicky. The ThinqShift podcast for professionals who aspire to be fabulous leaders. Those who not only succeed, but also purposefully seek to reinvent the world.
The word strategy can be interpreted differently depending on the level within an organization. From our perspective, the word itself has become foggy and overused. And so we get asked all the time what strategy looks like depending on who we're speaking to. Today we're going to provide our view how the meaning typically shifts if you look at it through the lens of executives or managers or employees, all of whom think they're being strategic. In this episode, we dive into the fascinating world of this word of strategy and how it's perceived at each level in the organization. Whether you're an executive crafting a vision, a manager turning that into actionable plans, or an employee executing the day-to-day tasks. Those differences between how we see the word strategy can make or break alignment. Let's spend a few minutes dissecting what it really looks like depending on your vantage point in the organization. And let's start at the executive level. We know that execs should be thinking about strategy as a long-term view, responding to external market signals, gambling on how to shift the organization over the next 5-10 years, which is becoming increasingly more difficult. For example, should we go into new markets, expand new product offerings, invest in large acquisitions? Vips, how do you think about strategy and what executives should be focusing in on?
That was really funny, Vicky. I think that was the most professional intro you've done thus far. I was like, wow, she's in full BBC mode today. I know. To get back to your question, though, to me, this topic is so fascinating because I think it's morphed over the years in terms of how we speak to people about it, and I think mostly it's because you would think over time things would have more of a common understanding and things would become clearer as they become part of our, known language,
daily use,
and known structure and use. And actually, this is one of those ones that I think has just been, abused, used, made to mean anything that someone wants it to mean at a given point in time. It's different by functional area. It's different by organizational type. It's different by industry. I see so many resumes or CVs that come into us where there's like people who are 16 years old who apparently are highly strategic. You know what I mean? Like that kind of stuff. And it's just...
But to be fair, in their world, they probably are.
In their world, they probably are, right? But it's one of these kind of, I blame LinkedIn for a lot of this stuff. I do, right? And I think it just became, a search engine optimization criteria that people started wanting from a title point of view, from a ego point of view. I think somewhere along the line, companies figured out that they could pay you less by putting the word strategy into your title, and it became an aspirational destination rather than a known competency set that was reasonably unambiguous.
And even if some companies have chief strategy officers, it moves away from being the executive's collective responsibility to a person, and then that causes a whole world of pain.
Yeah, and then there's different types, right? So in some organizations, that chief strategy officer, if you like, is the kind of person that's responsible for growth in terms of mergers, acquisitions, market positioning, that kind of thing. And in others, the chief strategic officer is someone that I can outsource a bunch of work to that I don't want to do.
Come up with a roadmap,
like a big brain, come up with a roadmap and a plan, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And in other organizations, it's this person has probably passed their sell-by date at this company, but I'm too chicken or too scared or for political reasons or shareholding reasons, I can't get rid of them. So let's give them a chief strategy officer title and let them rot in a corner somewhere for a couple of years until they go away. And that's, I'm being a bit facetious, but that happens, and we see it all the time. And that's before you add in, IT strategists and finance strategists and marketing strategists, and everyone thinks they're top of the tree, and therefore they see the world that way. And just kind of forget that the people they're talking to will either not get it, or if they have a different interpretation of what constitutes strategy, will just think you are clueless. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think something that is aspirational becomes a detriment to the person. But I find that quite amusing. But anyway, all of that was a bit of a preamble to your question. Now, I would say if I summarize it based on the kind of environment we're in now, in sort of 2024, probably the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years, when at the executive level, I think the focus is now more, when people say, are you being strategic? It's more, are we going somewhere? Is it aligned to a North Star or a sense of direction? Is it meaningful? Is it going to work from a external perspective? Is it going to work relative to an impact that we're trying to create, or a market we're trying to morph into? So I think, if you go back to kind of our 5 levels of thinking, which, if shameless plug to anyone who hasn't listened to that particular podcast, go and listen to it. But I think generally speaking, at the exec level, for smaller and to mid-sized companies, it tends to be more sort of systemic and structural. Mm-hmm. In terms of thinking. I think in very large organizations, though, executive level is really more like middle management, which we'll get to a little bit later, and it's therefore a bit more operational metrics, goals, that kind of thing, policies, procedures, that sort of thing. But I think for they would aspire, in the large organizations, they would aspire to be more North Star vision, direction centric, but probably feel constrained, both sort of organizationally or financially or from a span of control point of view. But I think generally speaking, most execs now are experiencing the word strategic as sort of big picture thinking now. Now, do they have the ability to act on that? That's a whole different question. But I think that's the kind of locus of how it's experienced. Don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do, because when you think of that level, it can feel very ambiguous. It can feel very amorphous. It can feel very intangible. And to everybody else around them, it can feel like, I don't really know what they're doing. What does that mean practically and tangibly? Right. And as an executive, it can feel like everybody else is thinking too down in the weeds compared to how I want them to be thinking and the pressures I'm feeling, because their span of time is so much longer. Their aperture is so much wider. They're looking at so many more different factors. And they need those in the organization to be focused in on the plans and the execution and getting things done. But in our experience, in our conversations, there's almost a mismatch in the type of conversation as we're getting into that, because those below them feel, well, I'm having a strategic conversation, but to an executive, it really is just a bunch of plans.
It actually demonstrates their absence of strategic thinking relative to what it's actually an own goal. No, you're right. You're completely right. And I think I think we should firstly say most executives are not good at doing this. So we're talking about the good ones, the fabulous ones, if you like. I think it's just worth stating, because I think a lot of people listening to this will be like, well, that's not what I see my executives do, because I think we have to go back to the fact that most executives are really middle managers, and in the fabulous terms, and maybe aspire to this level of leadership, but probably struggle to achieve it. And I think it's just worth expressing that, just in case someone's listening and thinking, oh, I don't see my execs doing that. Well, yeah, you're probably right, and I think that's part of the issue. But I do think one thing I'll put out there. There's a reason why I think this kind of North Starring or sort of vision, are we aligned to our vision? Are we aligned to our values? Those sorts of things. I think that's a downstream consequence of the fact that things are more volatile and uncertain, complex and ambiguous. Because in a world where things weren't, when things were a bit more stable and things didn't change as fast, it was much easier to align people around things that were lower down, operational, you set a bunch of objectives, you set a bunch of goals, everyone feels they've aligned to them, but you know, as an
looking
executive, you can feel
years.
safe knowing they're not going to change every 3 months or 6 months or 10 weeks or 2 weeks, or you know, you felt safe in the knowledge that you could provide that level of clarity, I guess, for an extended period of time. That's just no longer environmentally possible. So you've got two choices. You either try to hold the ocean back with a spoon, which is what I think most people do, and they try to pretend that you can be absolutely clear and pretend that things are stable. And the problem there is their employees get freaked out because it feels like they keep changing the goalposts on them. You know, their objectives change, their goals change. And that's a real killer, particularly if your compensation and promotions are aligned to those things. Okay? So the objective really at the executive level has been to try to get your people to anchor to something that's bigger, a bit more nebulous, more directional in nature. Because if people are aligned to that thing that's directional in nature, then you get more grace when it comes to course corrections and deviations from whatever it says in your objectives and goals on a short-term basis. And so you can actually maintain some level of trust and confidence from your employees, while at the same time changing things more frequently without it having the downstream consequences.
Yeah.
So I think there's a reason why I think it's becoming more important to be that kind of leader or that kind of executive.
And the pivot can be a little tough, because if you're used to thinking strategies more, you know, the next 3 years, the next 4 years, but now you're being asked to look beyond that and look at the big shifts that are happening in the market and internally, that can feel a little vague and ambiguous, and it can feel like, well, that's not really strategy. We'll respond to that when we get there. But to your point, if you don't do that, then it feels like things are constantly changing when things have to adjust.
So if you think about it from our 5 levels of thinking point of view, it's actually bad at 2 levels. Well, not bad, but challenging at 2 levels. One, it means that strategy, if you like, visioning and so forth in this dimension, it goes higher level, right? It pushes you up to systemic and philosophical. But at the same time, it creates a lot more pressure on short-term results, which pushes you down into tactical and operational. So what gets lost is the structural and systemic, right? Structural in particular. And that's why everyone feels like they're chasing their tails constantly, because everyone is desperately trying to act. Now, we'll justify it as we need to act on our strategy and we need to act quickly and we need to find a bunch of quick wins. But what you end up doing is you just end up on the hamster wheel, pedaling really, really fast and feeling like you're implementing strategy, but not really implementing strategy, because strategy has to be implemented at the structural level, not at the tactical level, at least not without going through structure. And that's, I think, the problem now. It's hourglass now. We do the bottom, we do the top, we don't do the bit in the middle. And that's why everything is so... And we do that in the name of action, quick.
Yeah.
But it's also foolish, because so much of that work is redundant, and you end up being you feel like you're being very efficient in terms of the tasks that you're doing and the actions that you're taking, but the results don't follow over a 6, 12, 18 months time frame.
Yeah, and a couple of thoughts on that. The one is, you either see, for those executives that do want to operate at the structural level, if they've got that mindset, it's reorg after reorg after reorg, and then it feels like death by a million cuts, or riff after riff after riff, whatever it might be. And that's not helpful to the organization, because it just feels like the deck chairs are moving around, or the contract with the organization has been broken. And it's not really moving the organization forward when you think of things like, we're going to have the biggest shift of all times right now, and that's with AI. You know, what's that going to mean structurally to the organization? What's needed, and what roles are needed, and for each role, which part of the role is actually needed? You know, so the whole view of all this is going to be so critical when we think about the North Star. So that's, what are the stresses? What are the stresses that executives feel around all this? Yeah,
so at the top, and I call it the inner C-suite as opposed to the wannabe C-suite, but you know what I mean by that. The biggest stressor fundamentally is, if we can't move fast enough, we're in trouble. And I think that's in relation to just the sheer nature of the amount of external change that we're all having to absorb. And I don't think any part of the economy is untouched by that. Whether that's because of geopolitical and national issues. in the world, whether it's because of demographics, aging population and so forth, whether it's because of technology innovations such as AI and so forth. I mean, that is a lot of dimensions of that is a lot of dimensions of systemic change all happening at the same time,
bringing in a lot of unknowns,
bringing in huge number of unknowns, and will create, on the one hand, the faster you move, there's all sorts of financial upside for moving quickly and solving it, because the next generation of giant companies will emerge out of this malaise. The flip side, though, is it's going to cause a lot of carnage, a lot of anxiety, and I don't just mean from an employee point of view. I mean in our communities. I mean in terms of policy, in terms of wealth distribution, and all of these things that impact society at large. So you got a lot of those sorts of things. So most executives that have that elevation level, they see a level of urgency that just isn't experienced lower down an organization at let's call it the manager or superstar performer level. Because if you think about it, the incentivization at those levels is to keep the train on the tracks. And so the train on the tracks looks like inertia. It works. Don't change it. We can't change so fast. People are going to be upset. People are going to be stressed. All of this kind of stuff, right? Whereas at the top level, you're like, I know it's going to. I know it's going to be disruptive.
We don't have a choice.
And what the question is, do we extend the agony for decades or years, or do we try to win through it, which is going to be more disruptive and less people friendly? And I think that's I think where you have to go back to the philosophical constraints around, the values of an organization and what matters most, I guess. But I think the problem is, because so many organizations are going to be structurally impacted, particularly by external events in the world and AI, even the ones that want to be safe and steady and collaborative and family orientated and all of these sorts of things, they just can't do it because they'll just go out of business, or they won't be able to sustain a level of return that their shareholders will accept. So it's going to force a speed of churn that their organizations are going to hate. And that's another reason why low personal power leaders are going to really struggle, because they'll get ousted if they don't have those skills. So I think you're seeing that a lot more. But it is not a great time. Well, it's a very challenging time, maybe, as the way I would say it, to be a CEO. Some people love that and they thrive in that. Most people, find it very painful.
Yeah, it's definitely a new era, that's for sure.
I see a lot of people saying, I don't want to do this. I've done my gig now. I don't want to be a CEO, or I don't want that. That's just, it used to be, I joked about it, your job was to keep everyone equally miserable. Well, that miserable layer is now a lot more miserable. So everyone, it's taxing. I think we don't,
also people's belief of what it was to lead a company.
That's right.
Has changed so much. It's always been tough and hard and a lot of unknowns, but it just feels exponentially more so these days.
Yeah, I think the and I think outside of the elite few, the upside is less there than it was, and the downsides have huge impacts on your personal life, on your relationships and so forth, and probably healthy from a society point of view, although maybe not from an economic point of view. That does mean that people are opting out of some of those roles, and to me that's a shame, because what it does do is then it means that the top executives, top leaders become more opportunistic and power hungry, and that creates a more that will create more highly directive and autocratic forms of leadership will be more in vogue for the next probably 10 to 15 years.
On that very somber, sobering note.
Well, there's goodness in that, though. We joke, right? I mean, I think we joke also a little bit from our own philosophical views on this, right? But if you think about it, when someone is highly directive and slightly authoritative, a lot of people actually derive a lot of comfort from that because they think someone's in charge and someone's in control and someone knows what they're doing, right? Now, in my experience, most people are making it up as they're going along at that age, at that level, excuse me. But it does have, it can pull people together as well. Just maybe different people or people with different philosophical beliefs.
Yeah, gives them a sense of safety and comfort that there's some degree of clarity, even if there isn't really. Okay. Well, let's move on to the manager level Vibs. So we talked about managers then in our definition and what we see. And not so much definition, but the way we see managers in organizations respond to strategy. They typically see it more in our experiences, the next year. What are the mid and short-term goals? What are the plans? How do I get my team to execute against the North Star over the next year? Developing a roadmap, thinking about the team structure, the process, in order to meet these long-term goals.
How do we work together would be another one.
Yeah.
How do we collaborate better? How do we, all of that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Phipps, what do you see managers focusing in on as they think about strategy?
Yeah, to me at a high level, I think at a manager level, what it tends to look like is some version of how do I know what I'm supposed to prioritize? Yeah, it's a little bit of so much to do, so little time. And, if I don't, what I hear a lot at this level is I don't understand our strategy. I don't know what it means. Or if they do understand it, I don't agree with it, but no one cares. So I think this is where you hear a lot of the language around sort of control the controllables. I've got no control over that. I've got no influence over that. So I'll just sit in my corner and do my thing. Okay. So strategic there tends to look more like, how might we restructure a team, restructure a group, create interfaces to work across functions or with partners or with vendors, or those would be like strategic execution things. And I think the way you look at it more, the way managers probably look at it more is what are the 2, 3, 4, 5 things we're going to change next year based on how we're working this year and what we're on the hook for next year versus what we're on the hook for this year. And because otherwise we'll just do more of the same. So I think at the manager level, it tends to look like goals, goal clarity, numbers, what is the number I'm supposed to hit, kind of clarity. I think you'll find there's a lot of problem finding at the manager level. Maybe not so much problem solving. And I think it's because it's easy sometimes to say, these are the problems that exist upstream, and until those problems are solved, this is never going to work. And I think that's almost like a coping mechanism for having to make decisions that you probably don't want to make or can't make, or putting on the Teflon or the sort of Teflon coat so stuff doesn't stick to you when it goes wrong. So I think strategic there is often a bit more, maybe a little bit more, I would say priorities and politics maybe is the way I would express it.
Yeah. So it's problem solving.
And they'll all, by the way, say, we have no politics in our company, all that nonsense, right? Everyone's opinion is valued equally and all this stuff, which all sounds great, but it's just not true. It's But I think this is interesting, right? Because, maybe another way to look at it was the manager level tends to look at strategic as things that are internal to our organization. Whereas at the executive level, it's more strategic is what's happening around us that is gonna impact who we are and how we're structured. And so I think that's probably the big difference. One's more outside in, where manager tends to be, strategic for that manager level is more, we need to make strategic decisions about key hires or strategic decisions about key teams, or, it's that kind of thing. It's more internally minded rather than externally minded.
When you mentioned politics and organizations, the definition that I love is when politics is when people choose their words and actions based on how they want others to react, rather than based on what they really think.
Oh yeah, that's one. Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. Yeah.
And I don't think anyone would disagree that happens in all organizations.
Yeah, sure. But I think there's also, to go another way, right? Again, I'm going to get a bit academic right now. I remember, when I studied politics, politics is the art of the possible. It's not the art of what's right. Okay, where philosophy is the art of what's right, or relative to a particular belief system. Okay, so I think what we tend to do is we tend to want politics that align to our philosophies, and vice versa. But politics itself is just the art of it's the art of doing what's possible. Now you play that the other way, okay, and everyone's going to celebrate people who are pragmatic and make decisions based on what's doable. And we celebrate that, right? Which is also just the type of the art of politics. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think we use the phrase in a way that's kind of polluted by our politicians, mm-hmm. right? As opposed to what the discipline actually is, which I think is a good distinction to make. Our especially in the current climate, we're recording this in November 2024. It's very easy to sort of misunderstand the meaning of a term and almost apply the street definition or the colloquial definition to something that actually is a discipline in its mm-hmm. own right.
Mm-hmm. That's a good distinction, Vips. So at the manager level, as they're thinking about team structures, priorities, this 1-year roadmap, problem solving, what do you see as the biggest stressors that these managers face?
Yeah, I don't understand why it's like defense mechanism behaviors. I don't see why we're doing this. My team's struggling. I need more resources, but we don't have the budget, that kind of stuff. I want to be seen, and I tell you what happens. I want to be seen as strategic, so I'll avoid downstream things and go into self-promotion. So I think what it often happens is people management suffers, meaning your team management suffers, while you convince yourself that you're focusing on bigger picture issues. And, you start hearing things like, I need to be at the table. I want to be at that meeting. I need to be seen in that group. So optics, the politics of optics, if you like, starts kicking in. It's a huge stressor, because I think what it then drives is this kind of imposter syndrome, where people are trying to fit into something that they're inherently uncomfortable with from their combination of content, positional, and personal power. And that's why you get a lot of stressed out, therapy-ish type issues at this level. Mm-hmm. And that's actually an interesting one, right? So generally, when you hear the whole sort of phraseology of I'm anxious, work is stressful, all of that sort of stuff, right?
Overwhelmed.
A lot of that stuff really is if you're a what I'll call a category 5 leader, a fabulous leader in our terms, right? Then you don't normally experience those things, right? So the people who are experiencing those things is often also an example of, wow, I just don't have the right talent in my company because they can't hack it. Mm-hmm. They can't deal with it. They can't deal with the reality of a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. And at the same time, organizations are trying to brand themselves in terms of being more supportive, being there to help. It's such a fine line, right? Mm-hmm. Such a fine line. And I think so. Therefore, what happens is all of those, resources get directed into supporting folks like that. And so then we convince everyone that that's normal and it's to be expected, which is good. But it has the consequence that the pool to actually choose from for the top roles doesn't exist. And that's why CEOs year after year in their surveys, Forbes do it every year, there's a bunch of them do it, they always complain that they've got all these people but they haven't got enough leaders. Yeah. And at the same time, you've got all these people who think they're leaders who are not exhibiting the characteristics of someone who could hack it.
Yeah.
And it's
and to them it might feel like the executives are out of touch, off with the fairies, all of that. But actually they
don't have to deal with the stuff I have to deal with.
Yeah,
they don't get it.
They're just looking at things in a completely different way.
Yeah, but that's a losing strategy because what it should really be telling you is I must be focusing on the wrong things relative to my aspirations, if indeed I have those. And this is kind of where I think why so many at that level just basically saying I'm done, right? They allow their careers to plateau, and it's quite nice to allow your careers to plateau there, because you never really you don't really have the torment of having your head in a noose like you do at the very top of a company.
Yeah.
And so I think we justify it on the basis of work-life balance or the kind of person that I want to be, the life that I want to live. And we wonder why we don't get the best leaders at the top of our organizations, right? I mean, it's a...
Yeah.
Plato got it right. Plato got it right like thousands of years ago when he said, the best leaders have to be forced to lead because they're too smart to realize that, they would never do it of their own accord. You'll have to force them to do it because they're too smart. They know it's thankless and horrible.
Too painful. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then the downstream of that, which moves us onto the employee level, is when you have a leader that is playing it safe and sailing along and not stretching themselves into that uncomfortable zone. Most that we've experienced aren't genuinely content with it. They're doing it more by default as opposed to, I really am choosing this consciously. And so the downstream of that is, it just feels to employees like there's tension here. I can't quite move it forward in the right way. They don't feel authentic enough. I can feel a frustration. So let's move on to the employee level. So employees see strategy. Typically, it's in our experience, when we talk to people, it's day-to-day tasks, day-to-day objectives that are being given to contribute to the overall success of the organization. What tasks can I do to complete a project or improve customer satisfaction or reduce costs? So what do you see employees focusing on as they think about strategy?
Yeah, so I think you're right. I think that's the optics level. So they're largely in the sort of tactical space because broadly speaking at that level, you're responsible for execution of some sort. You're, whether you call it action orientated, getting your tasks done, whatever, you're measured based on the output of your tasks by and large. And so I think the problem with that is, so strategic there tends to look like, well, who's defining those goals or those projects or those programs or those initiatives, right? So they see strategic as having a say in what those projects are going to be.
That impact them.
That are going to impact them or their area.
Yeah.
Right? And so this is kind of where you'll see, this is the origins of why strategy looks different depending on which functional area you grow up in. So if you grow up in corporate finance, strategy looks like the finance aspects of, the strategic financial aspects of that function, if you like. And the same for why you end up with marketing strategy and why you end up with, IT strategy or digital strategy or whatever. Okay. They're really just seeing it as the higher order methods, frameworks of their domain. Yeah. And so the danger with this one is it's fine for a subject matter expert. Yeah. But if you try to have we see it all the time. Technical people, for example, they want to go and they think they're going to have a strategic business conversation, and all they do is talk about IT, right? And technology. And if let's say you're a business leader who grew up through finance, right? You're gonna show your ignorance by the way you talk about strategy. So they can't even correlate to that because they don't have the experiences, they don't have the pattern language, they don't get it, right? And they're never going to get it. And so I think the biggest danger at this level is just not recognizing that my definition of strategy is really just operational thinking. That's okay, right? Just don't pretend it's something other than that, because it's kind of easy to it's kind of easy to show your ignorance outside of your core content power domain.
And the biggest stresses that employees feel at this state level when we think about strategy?
Yeah, I think it's things like, why don't people see it? It's so obvious to me. That's not how it works. You know, that's not how we build this, whatever it is.
We focused on the wrong things.
We're focused on the wrong things. Why are we spending money over there and spending a whole bunch of resources over there when we should be spending it on here? Because if we don't do this, all of that other stuff is irrelevant. Like, you see the whole world. What stresses you out is you see the world through the lens of the thing that you do. Yeah. And that's a bit of a challenge. I think the other one is probably a bit more, for your sort of the people who see themselves as very ambitious. Because I think, the employee level splits into many, you've got your kind of people who just want to do a good job and go home, that kind of stuff, right? But then you've also got sort of high flyers, if you like, at this level. And I think there, I think what you get is, strategic tends to look like, I want the ego lift of being experienced as someone who is in those circles where strategic conversations are taking place.
Yeah, for sure.
So you can feel excluded. You can feel like your career is being hampered. You can feel like if you had access, like, it becomes a silver bullet. If I had more access to strategic decisions, then I'd be more valuable. But you don't give me access to those, and then you complain that I'm not being valuable. And you get yourself into this kind of...
Plus, I'm the one that really knows how things work.
And I'm the one that knows how things work, and
me...
you guys are all smoking something.
Yeah.
So I think here, the biggest danger, that's a stressor, but the biggest danger is you show your arrogance and your ignorance at the same time while thinking that you are showing your intelligence.
Yeah. Because it's a very singular dimension of what strategy is that is very different to what other levels are thinking of.
I tell you another stressor here is, if someone would make that decision, then I could do it tomorrow. Right? This feeling somehow that you can make these enormous changes, and if I change these 3 fields in a database somewhere, everything will be okay. Right? And it's just, you have such a kind of your perspective on what constitutes total implementation is very narrow.
Yeah. And sure, it solves a problem, and probably a very valuable problem, but it might be not anywhere near where the leaders...
Or it might solve the wrong one.
It
might solve the wrong problem, Or one that isn't, it's going to have to be redone, or just not...
won't be necessary in 6 months or a year. Yeah. Okay. So let's move into, what can we do all about this? We've talked through the different layers, executives, managers, employees all have a different lens on this word strategy and how they think about it. Where to start?
Yeah, I think the way I look at it is, because the world is increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, I think for all leaders and for all employees really, they have to just get much more comfortable with the idea that they need to anchor to a sense of direction rather than a thing. Okay, and the way we call it a North Star, but what it is under the hood is actually a Think 360 view of what strategy is. So what I mean by that would be, there has to be a vision component of it, like a future thinking orientated vision that people can be inspired by and galvanized by. Then there has to be a set of essentially metrics or goals that represent what success might look like in that future. Then there has to be a recognition of what would success look like from a structure, process, policy, resources point of view. Okay. And then I think you'd also need a success that's ultimately valuable to your people, your talent. It feels good. It's in line with your values, your mission, the organization, the people that you want to be. And I think that casting of that thing becomes 10 times more important. And I think what we're finding now is, now you have to kind of do that at the enterprise level, but also at the departmental level, because it's at the departmental level where the rubber hits the road. And that's kind of why it's becoming so hard to create alignment inside organizations without thinking of it on those terms. So I would say that that's something that we have to take more seriously rather than just inferring it from something that's handed down to us from senior leadership. Okay, so that's probably the first one. I think the other one is just fall out of love with the word strategy. Like, it's just recognize that every time you use that word, it's a double-edged sword, and you could be showing your ignorance just as much as you could be showing your intelligence. Mm-hmm. So what that means is, at the very minimum, know that the person that you're talking to, do they predominantly work at that tactical or the operational or the structural or the systemic or the philosophical level, and know that from the receiver's perspective, strategic is the layer above the one that they live at normally. Okay. And that means that you have to be able to adapt to being able to articulate things like strategic imperatives or important priorities or so forth against each of those 5 levels. You have to become conversant. That's a skill to develop, to be able to do that so that you can get people to understand what you mean without unintentionally showing your ignorance or your absence of understanding by being too far in the clouds.
Yeah.
That'd be my second one. And the last one is, I think, this one's probably easier said than done, but I think there's something about every single person has to take a long, hard look at their stresses proactively, because some of those stresses will be unique to them as individuals. Some of them will be just a natural consequence of where they are in the career journey or where their organization is in the organizational journey. And I think being able to separate those out to knowing which ones are about me versus which ones are about my organization or where I am in my career, make it easier to calibrate, if you're getting stressed out over the right things, and then actioning the right things to improve on that are, ultimately are the ones that are going to give you the greatest bang for your buck in terms of not feeling stressed and succeeding faster. Mm-hmm. That would be my top 3.
That's awesome, Pips. That's awesome. All right, everyone. Well, the key takeaway I hope you got from all this, hope you found it useful, but this word strategy, as we said in the beginning, is overused, and it definitely is not a one-size-fits-all. It's anchored to many different things, and so if you can be clear that you have a North Star that is directionally correct and start to adapt to different organizational vantage points and address these stresses head on, you'll be able to experience as understanding what strategy feels like at different levels in the organization and help contribute to one and make it actionable, relevant, and impactful. So with that, have fun, be fabulous, and we'll see you next time.